Good? Okay, all right, we're going to get started. I want to welcome everybody to Duo Tech Talks. Welcome to everybody who's watching on the live stream from home. If you have questions on the live stream, do throw them into the chat, and we'll do our best to take those near the end. And want to just thank you all again for taking the time to attend this evening. Hope you have a great time. If you need to get up and grab food or anything during the talk, please go ahead. Restrooms are right around the corner for those of you here in Ann Arbor. Duo Tech Talks is our monthly technical speaker series here at Duo. Typically, we host these talks in Ann Arbor, but we do periodically do these also in Austin and in our office in San Francisco and in London. So if you're watching remote and in one of those areas, do feel free to catch us soon at one of those talks. But tonight we're really excited to have Wolfgang Goerlich here visiting us to give a talk on tarnished silver bullets. Before we get started, just want to see any announcements, shout outs, greets from the audience. Yay. Yep.
A local security conference, A2Y.asm, just opened up registration, I think, 2 weeks ago. So registration, I think, is on the order of $20, really cheap, highly recommended. Also, the CFP is still open until July 15th.
Awesome. Any other announcements? Yep.
Google Developer Group next week, Thursday, in the basement of this building, talking about Google machine learning. So come join us. At 6 or 7, I don't remember.
Thanks. Get your TensorFlow on.
Hi, I'm Brett Miller. I'm from Michigan Medicine. For everyone who didn't get the memo, that's what the University of Michigan Health System has been renamed to. Anyway, we've got a few security position opportunities, so if anyone's interested, please come over and see me after the presentation.
Awesome, thank you. Any other announcements?
Thank you. This Saturday, June 24th from 4 to 11 p.m., this has absolutely nothing to do with computers or security, but everything to do with beer, is the German Park Open Picnic. Come on out, have some fun. It's just off of Pontiac Trail as you head outside Ann Arbor.
Great, thank you. Any other announcements? Yes.
Also, there's Ann Arbor Healthcare Hackathon. We are having a gathering Friday from 6 to 8, but it's all day. It's a 24-hour event starting 8 o'clock Saturday morning and ending at 3 Sunday.
All right, last call for announcements. Okay, great. All right, well, we'll get started here. Just thanks again for everybody coming out tonight to join us at the Tech Talk. If you have any questions or anything about facilities, do feel free to just come find me. But without further ado, I just want to welcome Wolfgang Goerlich. For those of you who don't know Wolf, he's been involved in the security community for over 20 years. As vice president at CBI, went down in Detroit, which is a large security consultancy, and leads their academy there. Really excited to have you here tonight to do the talk on tarnished silver bullets. So welcome, Wolf.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks for coming out. You know, this talk is more a big picture talk. This is more a strategy talk. This talk reflects some of the ongoing challenges we've seen with encryption, right? And I was already asked, do we sprinkle on the pixie dust and everything's good? Yes, add encryption, buy blinking boxes, and hire a bunch of people and everything's fine. Solves all security problems. No, that's not what I'm going to talk about today. So yeah, I run the CBI Academy, which is for junior talent, and it's the most exciting part of my job. We just spun up Team 7 of the Academy. It's about 2-3 teams we spin up a year where we have an apprenticeship for 2 years and train these folks up. So it's a lot of fun. And in terms of announcements, if anyone is looking for entry-level security jobs, come see me. And I tweet a lot, I do boring videos, and I once drank holy water, which is a true story. Pro tip, label your holy water. It is relatively important. Also important, don't put it in 5-hour energy bottles, which seemed like a really good idea at the time. But if anything goes bad wrong today in terms of vampires or when we're doing threat modeling and you're concerned about holy water, come see me because I am immune now. or going to hell. So this is about encryption, all right? And encryption is supposedly really easy. If you guys think about the textbook, right? We identify our data assets, which I do, I don't know, 20, 30 assessments with different CISOs and security teams every single year. And they're like, what's your assets? And they're like, ha, I'm hoping you tell us. Good. So we're good there. All right, identify assets, number one. Two is assess the threats. And thanks to great talks like, or sessions like, Duo Tech Talks and whatnot, and the fact you guys are all out here, I'm sure you're getting informed and educated and keeping up on it. But the reality is that it's very difficult to know what is a real threat, right? I was just looking at Fireball. Did you guys hear about Fireball? January or June 1st, Checkpoint announces Fireball, this new malware. It's bigger than WannaCry. It's hit 250 million computers because it's this like download malware that runs in your browser and affects Internet Explorer. And I'm like, really? 250 people are running Internet Explorer? And it must not have just been me because Microsoft jumps and they check it out and they just announced like today that no, it's really like 10 million. And those are people who downloaded it on purpose. So we think we know the threats, but we really don't know the threats, right? They change way too often. But once you know the threats and the assets, you can protect it and encrypt it. And encryption always works, right? So it sounds really easy. It sounds like the silver bullet, but whenever we go to say, hey, you need to do encryption, and whenever I'm sitting down with the security leader, we have this thing where they go, it's okay, I'm running encryption because I've got HTTPS in my browser. You're like, no, that's not really what I'm talking about. Oh, okay, but my computer's protected by BitLocker. No, that's not really what I'm talking about, right? There's so many different ways encryption can be applied, and it's really dependent on those threats, and it's really dependent on those assets. And I think when we look at the major breaches, I mean, all these organizations were running encryption. I don't think Yahoo's like, hey, we don't have HTTPS, so we're in trouble. Each one of these companies had it, but they just didn't have it in the right spot, right? And part of the problem is because we put encryption in the wrong spot, it's misplaced or it's misconfigured, it doesn't actually stand up to the attack. And we think we're okay, and we're running just fine, our systems are just fine, but we're not checking, and next thing you know, we've got a situation where the Shakespeare quote of the day is, an SSL error has occurred, and a secure connection to the server cannot be made. Which I love. I mean, Will Shakespeare, like the tweet said, man, a man ahead of his time was fantastic. These things happen way too often. Encryption breaks. So what should encryption do? What should protect the organization's ability to achieve its mission by protecting the technologies that enable its mission? Any of you guys who have seen my talk, I apologize because I almost always say that, but that's so paramount. Every single control we do, every single technology we do, every single person we put in place has to tie back to protecting the organization. And without knowing how we're protecting the organization, what we're protecting from, it's very difficult. So where should we put encryption on? Well, one of the things that I've been thinking about is the intersection of where the organization generates value and where the criminals are motivated to attack, right? And this is something I've become like absolutely obsessed with. How do we know if I'm putting in a control, if it really matters to the business at all? Or if it's just like, oh, I've got a website, but if the website goes down, who the hell cares? How do I know if I'm putting a control in place and I'm encrypting some data, if it's really going to stop the attacker? Or the attacker's like, yeah, that's really cute, nice job on BitLocker, but really all your credit card numbers are over here. How do we get to that point? And it's encryption, which we're talking about today, but it's also a bigger thing that I've been really struggling with 20 years, thank you for making me feel old, in security, is trying to get to that intersection, right? The intersection of where we're protecting and preventing. I'd love to have conversations when we get to the Q&A. If you guys have some good ideas of like, yeah, Wolf, you said that, but really we should do this. Please hit me up with that. Because I think fundamentally, that's where we need to solve. And fundamentally, that's where we need to get to, is intersection of protection and prevention. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can get to that using some analysis, using some application of encryption. I'm going to talk a little bit about some threat modeling. And it really starts with protecting the business, then gets into prevention, and then I'll wrap up with some ways to build an entire program around this. So, protecting the business, right? It's simple, we just audit. I hate being called an auditor. Then you guys do like advisory services and they're like, oh, the auditor's here. And then you get in trouble because you just killed the receptionist. Oh, my academy guys will eventually, like when they're trying to needle me, they'll send me emails, hey, Mr. Auditor Wolf. I'm like, you're done, you're done. Not an audit, because audits suck. We all know if anyone's been on the receiving side of audits, they suck. We end up with a chart that looks something like this. Here's our risk rankings. Somewhere between low and whining is where we're at, and then they just stare at you, right? And you get this big stack of paper, and you're like, what the hell are we going to do? Again, it's so important, I think, to get to that intersection of protection and prevention, which you never get with a real audit. One of the ways we can get to this is doing something like a business impact analysis. So business impact analysis, you identify what the hell you're doing, you determine the key people and technologies, you figure out what the value is to the organization, and you estimate the value when it's disrupted or when it's down. I was having a conversation with an organization today, and they called this the steel thread. All the processes that are throughout the organization is the steel thread activities. I'm like, that is badass. What do? I protect the steel thread. You know what I mean? That just sounds cool. I like that. When I did BCP and DRP, you were like, what do? I'm like, I keep the lights on, and that doesn't sound nearly as cool. But this does come from business continuity and disaster recovery. It's one way to get at this. Now, the other thing you quickly find out doing it is, again, people just don't know. I was doing an assessment, and I was in a city. I'm not going to tell you which city. People try and Google it. No, you can't. I was in a city, and I'm like looking at the person in the conference room table and everything, and the shades were, well, I'm like, the shades are over here, and I'm like, they're coming in, and I'm looking at them. And it felt like one of those mafia scenes. They're like the light shining in their eyes, and they sit down, like, telling me what it is you do here. She's like, I don't want to tell you. I'm like, no, you must tell me. And they're going to give you one answer in that situation. They're going to give you another answer out to beers, right? Everything's fine. Don't fire me. All my stuff is good. Okay, do you use encryption? I absolutely use encryption. That night, later on, you go to drinks. You're like, so how's encryption working? Oh, it's terrible. Our BitLocker keys are on all our computers because our developers can't remember them, so they just print them all out and stick them underneath the passwords. Like, this is great. So this is really has to go beyond the audit. One of the things we start to do is lay out, hey, who's involved with what technology is being used, what the facilities are. This is a typical like BIA high-level diagram. You show this to any technologist, and they're like, what the hell, I can't do anything with this. So listen to see someone like, that's great, I had no idea. And you're like, yes, we're good. Because we have to start slicing these things down one layer at a time. So we start here, and then we start figuring out, all right, for this business process, what the hell technology is involved, right? What's the data flow that we need to actually protect? Can document the data flow for a business process. You develop the IT systems and the diagrams, right? And you identify what we need to protect and prevent. If anyone's done PCI or HIPAA, this is like standard PCI HIPAA stuff 101, right? Here's the data, flows through this. It supports this business process. It's open here and here and here. And it's protected on this enclave, and it's protected over there, right? We do this all the time for PCI. We do this all the time for HIPAA. We almost always find these areas where people think it's one thing, but it's another, right? This is a way of pen testing assumptions, which is crazy enough when you think about it. I'll give you an example, completely independent of this. Guessing Wonder Woman? Good movie? Everyone like Wonder Woman? All right. Now imagine the opposite of Wonder Woman. That's the movie I went to see. And it wasn't my fault. Well, it was my fault. I'll get to that. It was a Saturday morning, and I was in the kitchen. I'm making pancakes and everything. And my girlfriend and my daughter are talking. They're talking about animation. And my daughter doesn't like animation. My girlfriend makes a comment about that. Oh, but you really like this movie. And then a little bit later, I'm serving breakfast. I'm not really paying attention. And they're like, yeah, what about, this other movie, the Zootopia, and blah, 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 blah. I'm like, yeah, they love the Zootopia. I'm like, okay. And so I come in, and the girls have already talked. And they're like, we want to see Zookeeper's daughter. I'm like, okay. Or Zookeeper's wife. I'm sorry, Zookeeper's wife. You guys know, anyone know who that movie is? Like a couple people? All right, so maybe you guys know where this is heading. I'm thinking like Zootopia, it's animated. I'm thinking like Zookeeper. Was it like a terrible, like King of Queens was in a movie called Zookeeper that my kids liked at one point? He got married, this is great. So I go and I sit down and like I'm expecting animation. And everyone's like 60, 70 years old. I'm the young person in the room, which should have been my first indication. The movie starts and it's this happy zoo and the woman's on the bike and she's like throwing food and there's a camel and everything's happy. And then the Nazis come and they kill the camel and everything goes to hell. And by the end of the movie, I'm like, oh my God, they killed all the animals, what happened? I'm like, this is supposed to be a comedy. And my daughter's like, well, I told you. I said, no, you didn't. She goes, I told you the name. I said, and I quote, I like zoos and I like wives. She goes, well, I thought, I'm like, no, give me input. And so when I first told this story, my girlfriend's like, oh, I'm so sorry. And I'm like, no, it's not your fault, it's my fault. And I tell you this because this is the executive mindset. Every single time I go into these meetings, I'm like, you have this, and there's this technology. They're like, I like zoos and I like wives. I'm like, great, and you have encryption. Like, yes, we do. Because that's what they think, right? Until you actually sit down and you realize they're killing the camels, there's Nazis involved. Or hackers and ransomware, whatever. So we got to go through those conversations and start bringing some things to light. One way to do this is do the data flow analysis, which is one cut above, right? So we had the business process earlier. This begins to say, okay, we got some firewalls involved, we got some technology, we're getting our data through the woods to the castle, and this is some of the things that are supporting it. And then we cut it one more layer, right? If we start off with what the business is doing, show the technology, then do some technical analysis, we can apply some simple security controls, but scope it just to these things. When you think about most risk assessments, they fail because we're trying to do everything, right? Tell me how many systems you have and how many IP addresses, and I will tell you your risk. Well, it doesn't really matter because I don't know if that's important or not important. I don't know if that's a key system or not. I have no idea, right? You get a stack of a bunch of paper with that risk ranking. So we'll apply some very specific controls. Now, in relation to encryption, I would propose the following 8 controls. These 8 controls are high level. I can go into any detail you guys want, either here or afterwards. They're based on a couple different things. My pen testers always get in, right? And I feel really good about that. I'm like, my pen testers always get in. But let's face it, everyone's pen testers always get in. Does your pen testers ever get stopped?
We got rid of our pen testers.
Oh, you should outsource that to me. Hold that thought. But pen testers always get in, so that's nothing. But my pen testers are always like, yeah, they had encryption, here's how we got it. So after every major pen test for years, I've been getting debriefs. So I looked at that. My instant response, that's me. My instant responders, right, are always going in after the fact and saying, here's why they got breached. So I get all that data. So I looked at how the IR, or my pen testers break in, what the IR guys are seeing in threat, cross-reference that with what my GRC folks are saying you need for a PCI, HIPAA, NIST, insert acronym here. And came up with these 8. So first is the network being protected, right? Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. We all know to protect the network traffic. Fun fact, anyone running anything in Azure? No? Everyone Amazon? Yeah, smart move. I just got done with a cloud security assessment, and it blew my mind. Azure 2017, they told the client, we cannot do encryption for your network traffic. Cloud Foundry, Pivotal, right? Cloud Foundry runs on top of it. No, we're going to do SSL in the future. Okay. Let me run all my sensitive data over that stack. Okay, so protecting your network traffic. Active data files are appropriately encrypted, right? Again, something pretty straightforward, something pretty simple. Where this usually gets us in trouble in terms of active data or the files is something like we've got this fantastic Oracle system, and it's amazing. And I've got these perimeters around it and segmented, and I've got it hardened, and I've got hardened terminals to get into it, and you should pen test it. And we're like, yes, we're going to pen test it. And there's no one breaking into that. I know we said earlier pen testers always get in, but there's no one getting into that system, right? Because it's just too tightly scoped. But it's okay because someone built a business process right here outside the castle where they dump everything to spreadsheets and conveniently set it to everyone read write and share it over the network. Perfect. So the ability to protect the data files, right? Data at rest, system storage, BitLocker, we already know that. Purchase and development applications and data in use. Data in use is one that doesn't oftentimes get talked about. A few years back, I was working on a project called Incog. The source code's still out there on GitHub if you are feeling masochistic for any reason. But the whole idea was to emulate different ways of command and control to show how attackers could sneak data in and out. And one of the things I was using in .NET is this thing called secure string. So secure string will encrypt in memory your values, right? So I was going to demonstrate how the bad guys can't dump memory and get stuff out. Because if you think about Target, that's what they did, point of sale breach. What was the big point of sale breach recently? Was it Arby's? Was it? Yeah, Arby's, same thing. All the point of sales, right? They just snip it right out of memory and dump it to disk and shoot it out. So like, this is my secure string. And I was early enough. I was still in like the zookeeper, I like zoos, I like wives stage. I'm like, I am secure. A friend of mine went, let me take a look at that, right? FTK Imager, dumped it all out, searched it. Yes, my secure string was absolutely encrypted, which was fantastic. But my password was on the keyboard buffer, was in the .NET pipeline, was in the form, was captured like 6 other different places. So protecting the data in memory and encrypting in memory is vital when we start looking at attacks like point of sale systems and whatnot that intercept the data and sniff it out. Databases protecting sensitive information. Think about the Anthem attack where they logged in, sucked all the data out, and that was clear text, right? Encryption keys being protected and certificates being protected. Had a incident that we're investigating where the company was hacked. They found out they were hacked because they were trying to do a patch. The patch wouldn't apply. Change review board said, I can't apply the patch. The guy said, why? The guy said, well, because the patch doesn't come in Russian language files. Like, you could hear like the record skip, like, Russian, why are the Russian language files on a US-only system? Well, the Russians had broken into the system and conveniently installed the Russian language files for ease of use. Can't fault them for that. It was a great indicator of compromise. But the I like wives, I like zoos moment was, it's okay, guys, because we are sharing all our files encrypted, right? Every one of our files is encrypted using GPG. And all that GPG files are over SFTP. I'm like, we are safe. We don't need to worry about reporting any breach. I'm like, okay, that's fantastic. Where are the keys? Oh, they're on the server in case we need them. So needless to say, they were completely compromised because all the keys were available. Protecting keys, so incredibly important. Authentication and authorization is encrypted. You guys are in Duo. I don't need to talk about how important it is to have two-factor authentication. Although later when I get to two-factor authentication, we'll talk about some interesting things we're seeing there. And then finally, having a program that maintains the control. So 8 ways of checking and making sure the encryption has a program and it is sustainable and that we're not letting things fall through the cracks. And then for each control, do 3 things, right? Like do the thing, which is important. Make sure that we know how to do the thing, have the standards. And then make sure there's training and things in place that the thing is done consistently. So do the thing, make sure you know how to do the thing, make sure you have someone checking that the thing's done, yada, 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 yada. All right? Now, why is this important? Well, for one, as we already mentioned, so oftentimes there's gaps that allow things to fall through the cracks that allow breaches to occur. Another thing is that the encryption settings just plain don't age well, right? If you think about things like TLS, insert hash being broke here, SHA-1, MD5, they don't age well. New vulns are found, new workarounds are found, new issues are found. One of the things that really got me interested in this was the penetration tests where you'd find a vulnerability, give it to them, they'd fix it, you come back, you find the same vulnerability, and they'd fix it, and they do it again and again and again, right? Why is that? Because they don't have a program to maintain that security state. Same thing with encryption, having that program so you're checking very regularly. Another consideration about this is maturity assessments measure the feeling, right? Again, whether or not the light's shining in their eyes, you're out to beer, there's always that deeper reality, and it's so important that we check some of those things off. And it doesn't have to be a full-blown pen test. It doesn't have to be an advanced test. One of the things that my academy people do on every one of our things is just check assumptions. We are doing a engagement. We had an interview going on. Some of the people are in the room, some people are on the phone, and my guy's reading through the statement says here that you rotate your certificates every year. And they're like, yeah, we rotate our certificates every year. The manager in the back's like good. And he goes, but the portal that you're sharing this document on hasn't had the certificate rotated in 7 years is on TLS 1.0. Oh, yeah. Checking those things, right? We've got to start checking these assumptions. Another one that was my favorite was we were doing an assessment. They had all the tax records on this computer. And my guy's sitting next to her, okay, it's on the computer, what's the URL? She's like, here's the URL. Can I get to that? No, you can't get to that. It's secure. Okay. And besides, you're on the guest Wi-Fi. Okay. You guys all know the rest of the story. Punched it in, right? Someone had set it to read, right? Everybody, and shared it over the guest Wi-Fi for ease of use. Perfect, with tax records and all the data you might want to steal. So it takes some effort to check all these things, but it doesn't have to be as much effort as a full pen test. A lot of times it's just simply checking the individual security settings, spot checking as you go along the way. Okay, so on the protect the business side, that's the key thing, right? Figure out what the critical business activities are, your steal threads. Identify how the data flows for those. Figure out what IT actually enables it. We focus a lot of times on securing the IT, but it's really about protecting the business. And then define the appropriate controls and figure out what needs to be done. And not just through interviews, but also through technical testing. Before I get to prevent the threats, make sense? Questions about that? Nope, good. All right, protect the threats. First, when we talk about being kept up at night, right, who are the likely attacks? You guys all know this is script kiddies, the stereotypical hackers, insider threats, which we're seeing a big uptick in, hacktivists, cyber criminals, I'm gonna go through this pretty quickly, nation states, and so on. So when we start thinking about protecting things that are going to hit our castles or intercept the data along the way, a really important question is, where's the real danger? So we pulled some stats from Hackamageddon and looked at last year where a lot of these attacks were coming from, right? Because we always hear about the APTs and the threats and we need to buy the big boxes. Well, it ended up being about 4% were nation state actors. And of course, most of that was not in the typical businesses. It was more like in organizations that would have data that nation state would want to go after. 4.2 was insider threat. I think that should be higher. Whole nother conversation. But I'm wondering if that's just because we're not able to detect the insider threat. So encryption there would be things like file level protection.
Do you think that included like privilege misuse?
So the question is, would that include privilege misuse and accidents? I don't think so. That's a small number. I think these are publicly reported breaches. So a lot of times the big insider threats, they get away with it for a long time. Or if it's someone like who screwed up and pushed out the wrong setting and offlined some system, you're not going to do a breach report on that. Yeah. Someone did a setting and Amazon went down. Right. Is that a breach impact? You had a question? So the difference between insider threat and a phishing attack, right? From your security perspective, maybe not much if it's running in that box and looks like a user. Wendy Nather had a quote that I love, which is a sufficiently successful attacker is indistinguishable from the user. So very hard to know what that is. But in this particular case, what it is specifically is some insider did something bad, not necessarily clicked something, but deliberately did an action to cause a breach.
Maybe that's low because people have been attributing insider attacks more to phishing attacks.
Yeah.
You can't tell the difference.
You can't, right. That's a good point. Hacktivists, 11%. I thought anonymous was done, but they're still all over the place. But almost all of it was cybercrime, almost all of it. Now, interesting too is cybercrime in this stat includes the insider threat. Did you guys see that like these markets, like the Silk Road 2.0, whatever you want to call them now, will actually go to disgruntled employees. They'll look at Glassdoor and they'll see people who are complaining, and they'll find disgruntled employees and they will pay them to steal data. Pay them to steal data and upload it. Kind of fascinating. Almost all of it's in the cybercrime age though, right? So when we think about, should we worry about this or that or the new attack that some kid's doing or any number of things, really what it boils down to is if we're trying to figure out the intersection between what matters to us and what matters to the criminal, the question is where's the money, right? How can we follow the money to figure out what's going on? So we ask, hey, where does the organization generate value? Where is the criminals motivated to attack? And number one thing is credit cards. Of course, it's not under $10 a card, which is pathetic. It costs us more money and a headache just to get our card back. But since all the major breaches, the price of the credit card has dropped a lot. PII is $20 per identity. Again, think of the impact in someone's life, but they're only making 20 bucks. One of the interesting things I think about ransomware is it's one of the few types of attacks that the cost on you is pretty much similar to the cost that the money the attacker makes. Usually not so. And then personal health information, $60. So we can start to look at things. We do these threat assessments to figure out, all right, given these types of records, given these types of rewards, everything's susceptible to ransomware, so we can calculate that one. This system over here is PII, so we can calculate that per record. This system over here is some PHI, so we can figure out what that is. And then we can start to make some better decisions about where we need to invest our controls. Tell you an example of someone who didn't do that. Did you guys hear about the Paris rhino? Beautiful rhino that was in Paris. And when I think of Paris, I think of, well, Paris. And wine and other things. So, baguettes, thank you. I was struggling for the word. I don't think of poachers. That seems like South Africa, right? But a poacher had gotten into the zoo, the Paris Zoo, and unfortunately killed one of the rhinos. Killed one of the rhinos and made off with the horn. And I'm sitting there going, what the hell? Why would you do that in Paris? It's not like you're poor or starving or in an African, underserved village. Well, I looked at the cost of that horn, because I was really trying to figure it out. And then I remembered, I talk about this stuff. So I looked at the cost of the horn, and it was like $250,000 was the resale value on that. $250,000. If you had given that zoo $250,000 in gold, would they have just put up, the same type of fences? Or would they have done something completely different? You know what I mean? It changes our perception when we know that's a $250,000 animal right there, as opposed to, it's just another animal in our zoo, right? And once we have that changed perception, we can then figure out where we need to put the encryption in place.
Why are the banks robbed? That's where the money is.
That's where the money is. Was that Dillinger who said that? Yeah, I love that quote. All right. Then we can start looking at things like threat intelligence, right? So we know the threats. Now we can look at threat intelligence. One of my problems with threat intelligence is so oftentimes they're like, here's a bunch of bad guys, here's a bunch of things to worry about, here's all the IP addresses, go. And you're like, oh, what do I need to worry about? A little bit better way to do that is to figure out what the likely threat actors are for your environment. Here in this type of environment, we're talking about criminals. What they're likely to try and steal, what vulnerabilities you have, these vulnerabilities being driven by looking at the business process, looking at the IT, looking at the real vulnerabilities. And then figuring out, okay, what are the anchor points based on this particular system that a criminal is likely to use to get to that data and steal it, right? What's the anchor points and the ways that are likely to follow to go ahead and execute an attack? And then filter all that intelligence down to something that's more pragmatic and practical. And that kind of weeds out so much of it. Like 80, 90% of the time, it's all noise and doesn't even impact your organization. What could really happen for us given what we have and what we're maintaining? From there, we can do some threat modeling. We can take a realistic threat. We can build the attack lifecycle, kill chain, whatever you want to call it, based on those anchor points. We can figure out what controls are important, and we can design some specific encryption use cases. Now, from threat modeling, I like to think about it this way. Bear with me. I'll get to a visualization. I'll bring it right back to information security, I promise. So if you think about the vampires, right, and the werewolves trying to get to our friends and family, our loved ones, our data in transit, and our castles. Of course, he only cares about that. The werewolf's going to do major damage to our castle, flip over our wagon, and kill our people. Not a good thing. So we can start looking at what controls are in place, right? What can we do to stop this? Holy water, as I mentioned. I got you guys' back once again. Silver bullets, sorry. Stakes, yes, in my car. And walls. So we can look at how each one of these threats would be stopped by an impact on its way to get to the assets, as a way of modeling and figuring out which threats would have the most impact. So the vampire and the werewolf. And then from this, we can say, okay, this particular control would have a stopping power over 2 of the threats. This particular control is only 1. And we can begin to make some good decisions. Does that make sense as a threat modeling approach? Very simple, very straightforward. So we take our normal threat modeling. This is the MySec attack path. If you guys already seen this, this is a simple spreadsheet that lists out the stages of attack, the tactics, and the controls. So for example, if you're in the middle of a lateral breach, you're doing side scanning, you're going to use your host level firewall, endpoint isolation. You're going to look for network problems, block some site-to-site communications, isolate that host, right? So each one of these with the defenses. You can roll this up into something that looks something like this. For you guys, if you're interested in doing this, this is called a sand key diagram. It's off of Google's API. The charting API is completely free. You just basically spit it at JavaScript, and it builds the entire menu. But using this, you can see which type of controls would have the most stopping power. And this particular attack for SMB, man in the middle, you're going to be stopped by authentication and encryption, for example. So this allows you to hone in on which controls are going to stop most attacks. So a couple considerations there, right? Non-specific threat intelligence is not intelligence, it's noise. It's just a big clatter of data that we're getting if we don't have something to make it relevant to what we're trying to prevent and what we're trying to protect. And encryption effectiveness is very, very threat specific. It really depends on what that threat actor is actually doing, whether or not the encryption is going to even matter. So no pixie dust, I'm sorry. All right, now let's walk through some encryption. Oh, real quick before I do this, these are example scenarios of things we've seen, doesn't reflect any of our customer data, yada, yada, yada. Not a real world. All right, so example one, encryption, remote access to healthcare, because they got your EMR over here, right, your medical system, we got a data warehouse over here, we got some email. We can go ahead and map all this out. Medical personnel using their own personal laptops to connect over a firewall. And from that firewall, they're going to RDP, remote desktop, yada, yada, yada. Walking around this, we can start saying, okay, this is unencrypted, the storage layer, this is unencrypted, this is unencrypted. We can look at two-factor, right? We got two-factor for email, we got two-factor for the EMR, but not for the data warehouse. We can begin to see where we got some strengths and weaknesses in this particular model. And we can then flip that around and do one of those threat flows. So we're trying to stop information disclosure or elevation of privileges. We can look at this back to here and say, well, part of the problem with those is a lot of unencrypted traffic, especially SMB. So we can encrypt the traffic. We can also look at encrypting the authentication, again, back to protecting this data warehouse. So we can lay it all out. So stop the bad guys from hitting the stuff that they want to steal based on these controls, and look at how each control is a particular stopping power. Now, the width or the thinness of each one of these is actually based on the number of records when we do it. There's a couple different ways to show risk, but I was trying to demonstrate with these particular models how many records would be stolen from each particular path. So rolling that up, we can then look at, okay, healthcare information is clear, there's weak encryption, creds are exposed, and we can make a business case for doing authentication. If you look at this from a control perspective, based on those controls, we can get percentages of control coverage and look at it from the stopping power of the controls, right? So we've got a lot of weaknesses around the database and the network traffic side, but most of them are around authentication. And this particular model, there was no key management at all. Another one was payments. What was interesting about this one in particular was, again, checking things as we go. Like, yeah, everyone connects over HTTPS through the website. All right, that's great. So what do? You type in HTTP just to see, right? And we found out that, no, in fact, it would accept both HTTP and HTTPS. So the security guys, well, what the hell? Get him on the phone. So we get him on the phone. He's like, do you know this is HTTP instead of HTTPS? He's like, we have HTTPS? Yes. They had passed out the link in email and documented all HTTP. So they thought they were running SSL. They thought they were just fine. No. But okay, payment system, connect over it to the website. From the website, this is a traditional model, right? All clear text in here. I say traditional model because newer systems should not do this. As mentioned earlier, Azure makes you do this, which sucks. To a middle tier system, so they enter their credit cards. This goes to your cardholder data and payment service processor. That's exchanging up to your payment processor to get the act back and get the money over to your accounts. And then all this goes into your data warehouse where you're doing your analytics and whatnot. Again, walking around it, you can start to see encrypted, clear text, encrypted, encrypted, some tokenization going on over there. Storage encryption, nowhere really. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, on the two servers and not on that side. One of the things I oftentimes hear is, well, why would you encrypt storage at rest for virtual machines? no one's going to steal the virtual machines, right? I mean, usually storage at rest encryption is up here in case someone runs off from the laptop. But because of the insider threat, even though it's a small percentage in what we're seeing, because of the insider threat, we're oftentimes recommending these for critical systems. Because what we've seen is people who have control of the hypervisor, but not over the application, will take that, mount it, steal data off that way, right? Takes the snapshots. And because it's not in line with the security system, there's no monitoring, no logging, no alerting. Take snap, mount it, steal the data. So we're moving more and more to doing this level encryption on the actual key systems. Active Directory being another one, because of course that's where all your creds are. Looking at threat model looks something like this. With information disclosure and spoofing, encrypting data in databases, active files, protecting data in use. Should mention that protecting the use is the cardholder data, because of the way this was architected, was in clear text in memory here and in here, token on down. So protecting data in use to get to cardholder data, and then putting in place a centralized key management system. So when we did the analysis this way, we said, okay, we got some appropriate authentication controls, that's good, but we're exposing the payment data in memory in the databases itself. Good business case for PCI tokenization. Do our graph, see where our weaknesses are, and use this to justify what needs to happen. One of the things that gets out of this is when you start talking about encrypting in memory or encrypting in mobile, especially with sensitive data, this concept of encrypting everywhere. So if you take a social security number as a good example, generally you shouldn't ever need to decrypt that social security number, right? You have it. Very rarely do you actually need to look at it. Maybe the last 4, but that's about it. So if we move to a model where it's encrypted the minute it enters the application system, right? On your mobile, bam, it's encrypted. On your website, bam, it's encrypted. And it's stored encrypted. You can still do the same analytics, because analytics are usually off primary key, right? Social security number is unique. Do you have a unique encrypted value? But at that point in time, now it's encrypted across the entire chain. So if traffic doesn't get exposed to clear text, or disks do get mounted, or memory does get scraped, it's still protected. Does that make sense? Moving it as close as possible to being encrypted. And then only decrypt when you actually need to use it. So one of the things we saw here was a client built that type of model, and it was really damn good. They had encrypted a use at the Windows client, they had a web client. Mobile was off of the web client to a mobile device, APIs, whole 9 yards. And therefore, they were able to then adopt big data because they could send that encrypted device into something like Mongo, where it was replicated multiple times, and maybe cleared text in Mongo, but still, because it's just one value, you could still do the analytics and everything. I do want to talk real quick about the web client and the API, though, in two-factor, because one of the things we're starting to see is organizations that rolled their own two-factor. I've seen this in like 3 or 4 pen tests now. They rolled their own two-factor, so they did not apply it. There's 2 problems here. Either one, rolled their own two-factor on the web client, and then didn't put any like restrictions. So it's like enter a 6-digit number, but there's no brute force description, so you can just like blast all the numbers you want, right? Like password cracking, brute force it. And there you go. Now you're in. Second thing that we're seeing with people who roll their own two-factor is they try to do, instead of using OAuth, they try to use their own tokens, so you can still do cookie-based attacks. There's a great talk in Gurkhan about this, about rolling your own crypto and the challenges therein, where basically these folks are rolling their own and using easy-to-guess tokens, like, oh, it's just the MD5 of the username, and then you just MD5 it, and now you get your token. The other thing we're noticing is, and this wasn't even a small company, this was Microsoft, not consistently doing two-factor against the whole stack. So Microsoft last year had a weakness in their API where they were not requiring 2FA on certain API calls. Someone found that, they would then brute force, get in that way, and use that token to authenticate into OWA and the rest of the stack. So, in terms of authentication, rolling your own, some key things there, having two-factor against all the layers, API reporting, web client and up, not rolling your own, using OAuth if you can. Here, Brute force creds I mentioned, multifactor I mentioned, session hijack and session prediction. Another thing is the ability to go at that physical storage. I was mentioning booting up VMs, right, and stealing data out that way for the insider threat, booting snapshots and getting at it that way. So one of the things, too, about this is, and I touched about it on key exchange earlier, is every time we put in one of these controls, we the good guys usually go, yeah, we stopped them. And one of the things I really like about talking with my pen testers, every time I go into a client and I advise them on how to build a better program, I get really like, yeah, I stopped them. And then we send my pen testers in and they break it again, right? I wish controls would just, I put that in place, leave it alone, right? The criminals should just stop, go home. They don't seem to do that. So as we start elevating the encryption, using it more frequently and in more places, of course that means we're moving the criminals to other areas. And part of it, I talked about really bad key management earlier in terms of that the breach where they're doing file level encryption, they had all the keys in the box. But part of it too is, as we move towards more encryption, the attackers are naturally moving towards stealing the keys. So putting in place things like good key management with a centralized hardware security module that can pass out over KMIP the keys to file server storage, applications, whatever it may be, such that we can really harden that, that control, because as we do it more, the criminals are gonna wanna break it more. All right, so analysis of this. We got some opportunities for encrypting authentication, the applications, the databases. Got a business case for key management. That was the weakest one of that other case I was showing you. They're already doing data at rest, which is pretty good, and protecting the network traffic where they were able to, using HTTPS and IPsec. All right, so yeah, encryption without key management, it's not encryption. So when we start looking at things like the IT diagram and scrolling on into it, from physical storage on up, the closer we get the data to the actual data itself, the more it's protected through each one of these layers. This is where things like file at rest and, scroll ahead, application layer encryption comes into play. If you guys haven't seen that, this is PKware, but roll your own. There's a number of them out there. What I like about this is application layer encryption traditionally encrypted it something like this. Pro, you knew it was encrypted, and it was a distinct value. Con is that if you had any other systems that you're trying to feed this encrypted data to, I've got my analytics system over here and I'm going to send the data. It's expecting a credit card number, and it doesn't get that, and the entire system then falls over, right? Because it doesn't know how to process that data. And unfortunately, so oftentimes when we're trying to inject controls, we're doing it in such a way that we have to be aware of all the other systems in the realm. So another way of doing that is formatting, preserving encryption. FPE, which is now in this standard. Again, it's showing PKware API, but choose your API here. Voltage would be another one that comes to mind. The trick of the format preserving is it encrypts it in the same format. So social security number, encrypted still looks like a social security number. A credit card still looks like a credit card. A name still looks like a name. And we can use this key value on all our downstream applications, on all our analytics systems, on all our processing systems, because it is guaranteed unique, without having to change or modify the structure and the format and the database columns we've already put in place. So pretty damn handy. So an overall threat model, putting it all together, right, your thieves, your malicious insiders, your criminals, all your silver bullets. We can look at your physical storage for that particular IT environment, your virtual storage, encrypting of the databases, the column levels, which adds 10 to 15% overhead, so a lot of people don't do it. Using tokenization or format preserving encryption. Format preserving encryption in an application has overhead, but the overhead is when it's encrypted or decrypted. So if you encrypt and use it everywhere, you don't have to incur that same overhead, right? You're not having to go through every single column when you're doing a search, for example. So a lot less overhead as you move down the stack. And then we have more protection again, as if it's in a file by accident or if it's in the wire or whatever, that data element itself is still protected. The only downside with format preserving encryption is this concept of fail open, fail close, right? If your security system fails, is it open or closed, and do you know? If everything looks like a social security number and you stopped encrypting, I tell one of my academy guys, go look at that text file and tell me if that's encrypted. They're like, yeah, it all looks like social security numbers. Good. But is it encrypted? We don't know. There's no way of knowing, right? So that's one of the downsides to this approach. So that's one of the reasons why I have seen orgs do the other way using the application level. All right, next steps, wrapping up, we'll go to questions, recapping, right? We want to protect the organization's ability to achieve its mission. We want to do so in a way that figures out what the value is to us and figures out what the value is to the criminal, acts out of that. We can do that by starting with our IT and looking at the various controls up the stack, go one level higher and look at the data flow diagram, oftentimes finding processes and ways that people are using the data that we wouldn't ordinarily see that is introducing risk, and go all the way up to the workflow itself to talk to the CISO, right, or the executive team about what's going on and what the value is. With that, we can look at specific controls across the way, do threat modeling to figure out what controls need to be put in place and where we need to apply encryption. And some next steps, this really is not for folks in the room, but if you're going to build a whole program around this, you know, you'd start with identifying your business activities and your threats. Again, that's not easy. It's really not easy. But if you can filter that down to just what matters and just what we have and what weaknesses we have, it becomes a little bit easier. First 3 months, having an activity to go ahead and do this. What I sometimes see is CISOs who will make a habit of every quarter meeting with one of their business units and walking through just whiteboarding what their business processes are, and then taking them back to their CIO and say, okay, what IT is this really? And figuring out what's strong, what's weak, and then feeding this up to our threat intelligence folks and our threat hunters so they can know what's coming down the pike that actually applies to us. And then 6 months building that up into a practice, right? Being able to protect the business and prevent by making some good business cases, some good decisions on where encryption should go and why. And that's it. It's as simple as that. Encryption's easy. So what questions you guys got for me?
Questions? I'll walk the mic around. Nick?
I think that's really interesting talk. And so the last point you said about encryption is easy, and obviously I know you're being facetious. And I wonder about, though, how much people outside of the security community maybe take some of this too literally. Like they hear encryption is easy, or they hear security is easy and things like that. And maybe they get the wrong impression that, oh yeah, we can just roll our own crypto. Our developer, yeah, they're smart. They can do this right. Of course they can. And maybe that's not a good idea.
Yeah, so anyone who watches the recording who's not in security, I'm being facetious. Encryption is not easy. But one, I think what's important is the math's good, right? Encryption doesn't usually get broke because some gentleman did the math wrong and forgot to carry a 1. The encryption usually gets broke because we didn't implement it in the right way. We didn't implement it with a threat-specific approach. And then once it was done, we never went back and checked if it was still operational. So I guess what I'm saying is, generally speaking, for people who are knowledgeable, what I'm pleased with is, excluding Azure, which I'm still not over, for the most part, to use the football metaphor, the inches we need are all around us, right? The technical controls exist in code and systems to implement a lot of these controls. So it's not like we have to roll our own or we have to do the math. That part is a little bit easier. I think where so much we struggle is building a program and knowing when and what to do.
I'm the co-chair of IPsec that got the standard out. That work group ate 3 pairs of co-chairs, and herding 300 cats was a wonderful experience.
I'm jealous.
But the model the model that I use, and a number of others use, is that security at the layer 2, the network layer, address the risk and liability of the network owner. I'll get to that in a moment. Security at the internetworking layer, which you say network, but really internetworking layer, is addressing the risks and liability of the system owner. Security at the transport session layer address the risk and liability of the application owner. Security at the data layer address the risk and liability of the data owner. We will be doing all because they are different players with different risks and liabilities. For example, if you have a metropolitan WAN, you don't really have control of what's going over that link, that physical link. And you know that there are bad players out there who'll be going with the submarine, picking that cable up, that fiber up off the ocean floor, and putting on a commercial off-the-shelf device, which at fiber speeds will be pulling the data off that fiber.
Yep.
So you'll be putting in an 802.1ae encryption on that Cisco, Juniper, whatever box is, on that fiber as it leaves your premise. Because you, the owner of the physical network, have to address your liabilities. Because you're the one who's going to be on the floor when it's found out that that's where that particular thing was collected. So we do all these things, but of course you're addressing more here, the risk and liability of the data owner. And people say, oh, I have HTTPS. But that's addressing the risk and liability of the application owner, not the data.
See, I like what you're saying here, which is not only is encryption threat specific, but encryption is owner specific, right?
Yes, it's owner specific. And of course, as you say, you have to be agile. We got some new things coming on here in this area. And I'm really looking at Checkik for replacing SHA-256 and AES CMAC and some of the other things that's coming there. We may have some really interesting things coming up. The new Edwardian curves. So there's some you better be ready for, again, another set of changes in this area as we're addressing these risks. I'll be in the IETF in Prague in a month. And,
Fantastic.
And that's what I do. But look at it also in this way when you're talking about to understand why do we have so much encryption but it doesn't work? Because it's easy to do HTTPS. And it's important to do HTTPS.
Yeah.
But for your business process, as you say, encrypt the data because it's where that data is. The data is your value, and the data is in many, many places, and that's where that's where the business owner liability is.
Right.
But in a factory floor, where you can shut down a factory, you're very concerned about what is on your factory network.
Yes.
So there you're concerned about there. So if you're running a factory, you're not so concerned about the data,
No.
but you're concerned about the devices.
You're spot on. I did assessed 15 different factories last year for industrial controls. And no, who cares if my telemetrics are out? I don't care. But if any of those, even one of those devices goes down and the line stops, oh, forget it. Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's fascinating. So
Other
threat
questions?
specific, but also owner protection specific. Thank you.
Hey, so really nice talk, thank you. I just had a question when you were talking about threat modeling. You mentioned, that kind of at the end of the day it was about where the money was. But then you also said that hacktivists were about like 11% of attackers, and I have to imagine that like a lot of hacktivists probably don't give a damn about money usually. So, and yeah, I realize that the majority of them are like college kids who just learned how to use Metasploit or something, but there are also sophisticated ones too, right? So how do you model for that?
There's money there too, because money on the company PR and
There's money lost, but there's not necessarily money gained. So one of the things that I went through, I walked through the different actors, and then I said for the next part, I'm just going to focus in on the criminals for my game, because those folks that don't have anything to gain, right? This is like the Joker, right? He wouldn't burn the money. What the hell? I still don't get that. No, those are the worst, most difficult guys to throw out because it's very difficult to figure out what they're going to go after and why. And the reward to them, there's an old XKCD comic, right, which is where they like took down the CIA website. Have you seen this?
I don't think so.
They're like, the CIA website has been hacked. And what the normal people hear is like, oh no, the CIA has been broken into. And what security people hear is, oh, someone tore down a poster with CIA on it, right? Because the value to us is much different. So when it comes to things like unplanned or hard to model folks, like script kiddies, attacks of opportunity, like WannaCry or whatever, what I'm looking at more, instead of it being a financial model, is a hygiene model. Right? If you can raise your hygiene to a certain level, those activists are going to move on to a simpler target.
Right.
Yeah, so you're spot on. What I've been talking about around this type of modeling is targeted at those criminals with a financial motivation.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Other questions?
Welcome. So, speaking of sort of hygiene, I'm wondering about if you mentioned overhead in a little bit, like a 15% overhead for some of your solutions.
Yeah, database encryption is pretty heavy.
Yeah, so do you model anything in terms of like kind of the base, if you're doing something like a larger company, where you do have people like using a login all the time or that sort of thing, do you model, or is there a way to kind of prevent the, like, we have this great password system and it does a whole bunch of stuff, but I just put it on a sticky note and put it on the side of my desk. Like at some point your problem is that at the basis level, somebody's like, oh, that link looks interesting. And they've had training, they've had all this other stuff that says do not click on the link, but they kind of do it anyway. Like, is there a space to kind of, how do you model against ease of use in a workflow?
When you start to look at that, there's two different answers for that. One is there's a technique called quality functional deployment, QFD. And QFD comes from, I think, Six Sigma, if I'm recalling correctly. And that's a technique of pulling around several factors like ease of use, do I have invested technology, is it going to slow down my business process, laying those out, and then doing quantitative and qualitative analysis for that in the table that shows you heat spots. So that's one technique I'll use. To figure out if I'm going to make a recommendation, is it something people could use, or is it going to be like, no? The other thing is, and I very rarely have had time to actually do this, but I've looked into it, is there's an entire field of course about security economics, right? Applying economic theory to security decisions. And so there's a lot of meat on that bone, and unfortunately I haven't had much time to explore it. But that's the other thing. For every time you insert cost or time into the process, you, in some situations, decrease the security by introducing manual errors, or people are going to work around it.
So along that line, is there a possibility to, once somebody implements a solution, is there a possibility of like kind of, a week and a half or something just to see how these people are, or I guess that might be a follow-up check-in. Say like, okay, we've implemented securities. Let's see how people are working with it at the base level.
Right, depending on the control, absolutely. Especially if you put a control in, like do the thing and then do the thing, make sure they're doing the thing. If you put in a control that's checking, I'm going to take something simple, like I'm a developer and I write static analysis. I've taught me not to do this. I have a tool that checks, right? If you create a tight feedback loop where you're checking and getting that metric right away, you can then address the problem.
Thank you very much.
Other questions?
We'll get you next.
First of all, very good talk.
Oh, thank you.
Question for you. What do you think about the approach of going with vulnerability and asset value? Because a lot of attackers out there don't necessarily target you specifically. They're just looking for a platform, or maybe if they find one, they just go looking for good stuff.
Yeah, and that gets back to what I was suggesting about hygiene as a model, right? So cost valuation makes sense when the attacker knows who you are and is trying to rob you. Cost valuation may not make sense if it's malware that's scanning for the next open vulnerability, or if it's a hacktivist firing off a tool, right? Or if it's something like WannaCry, which is just spraying everywhere trying to find a toehold. So in those cases, what you end up looking at is more of hygiene, right? Removing the common toeholds into the environment with tools that you can, like a vulnerability scanner or whatever, and doing good vulnerability management, patch management. More of IT hygiene.
And that comes on business continuity risks.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Wolfgang,
Hey.
I had a question. I think when you showed your Sankey diagrams, you were indicating that what was being measured was records. Is that correct?
Yeah, so let me go back to one.
Well, that's not really my question. I'm just making kind of an observation. But when you gave those statistics, 4.7, and someone called out 11%, what
Yep.
was being measured there?
Oh, for the attacks?
Yeah.
That's the number of reported breaches. That's on Hackageddon.
Yeah, I guess my observation is that every time I see a number reported in some type of security context, it's really fuzzy what's being measured.
They are.
Is it reported incidents? Is it bandwidth? Is it cost? I mean, it's very fuzzy.
Every number is incredibly fuzzy in this field, right? Because it's, as much as we try and make security a science, with the exception of the work you're doing, the work we do is very qualitative, right? It's a lot of times it's a gut or a total or a count, and you can do the statistics either way. If you look at Check Point saying 250 million computers compromised, that was based on their analysis. Microsoft went back and looked at it again, it dropped down to like 10 or 20. So the breach stats are total number of breaches reported by a breach aggregator, not total number of records lost, breaches reported. So I was looking at breach actions. In a Sankey diagram, what I'm looking at is low, medium, high to determine the width of each one of these actions. So I can see, this particular one is really low because the chances of them bypassing multi-factor authentication to get health records, not many records are going to come out of that because you'd only be able to get one person's account and siphon it off. So what we do here is order of magnitude. Number of records that would be lost by this particular action in a breach, and then grouped into low, medium, high. Now, there's different ways to do it. This is really looking at impact. So when you're looking at Sankey diagrams or you're looking at threat flows, depending on what you're measuring, if we were to do something like, we were talking about hacktivists earlier, right? So if we were to do something like, I want to model a hacktivist and their impact on my brand, then I'm going to have to collect what the impact of the brand would be and measure that low, medium, high as opposed to record count.
And the ISACs kind of protect the members of the ISAC in terms of there are a lot of ISACs out there now. In fact, just today we had a presentation on the auto ISAC at SCAR.
Nice.
That the ISACs protect the organizations attacked in terms of how and where it's reported. Only if they want to report it out of the ISAC does that information then get known to be aggregated in many of these reports. So within inside that, whatever that community is, whether it's a financial ISAC, whether it's auto ISAC or one of the other ones, you really have a closed reporting environment, and much of that information does not get out to general collection. An extremely need-to-know environment, and they have legal protection for that.
So to dovetail on that, ISAC being what? Information Sharing and Analysis Center. They're industry specific. Sometimes you have to pay to join. Sometimes they're open if you're in the industry. I was in the FS-ISAC for many years. And what we would do, it's the exact same thing with the threat intel, right? They're like, we got breached, something bad happened. You're like, well, what happened? They're like, here's the IP address. And you try and model that or anything. So it can be very frustrating. But to your point, A, it's a great information sharing platform. B, that information doesn't go outside the ISAC usually. And then C, if any of you guys are in one of those industries and can get in it, you make friends and you pick up the phone and go, yeah, I saw your email. What can't you tell me? And you have a great conversation.
All right. Got time for one more question here.
Thank you for the talk.
Yeah.
You mentioned about keys management. So what do you recommend since key management seems to be the challenge?
I recommend using hardware security modules, which are purpose-built appliances for key management. Much like it's very difficult to roll your own crypto, I think it's very difficult to roll your own key management technologies.
It's not very hard to roll your own crypto. It's impossible.
It's impossible. Fair enough.
There are probably only a couple dozen of us in the world who know how to do it right.
But not everybody has like 250K spent on HSM.
All right.
That's true too. So there are, yeah.
Any other last quick questions? All right. Well, I just want to thank Wolf again for coming by tonight to do the Tech Talk.
Thanks so much
Appreciate
for
it.
having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. thanks to everybody who came out tonight. For any of you who might be watching remote in Austin, we have sort of a mini Duo Tech Talk on Tuesday night next week. So do check the meetup site for more information on that. Thanks again, everybody, for coming. Hopefully we'll see you next month.
Yeah.